Hello, everybody. This is going to be 13.5 Effects of the New Deal. And we're going to start with a quote from Franklin Delano Roosevelt's wife, and a power in her own right, Eleanor Roosevelt, who said, "It isn't enough to talk about peace, one must believe in it. And it isn't enough to believe in it, one must work at it as well." So, we are going to be looking at today, we're going to be identifying social and political contributions of Eleanor Roosevelt, her friend Frances Perkins, and other women involved in New Deal programs. We are going to explain how the New Deal expanded economic opportunities for racial and ethnic minorities. We're going to analyze how the New Deal changed the shape of American party politics and lessened ethnic and social divisions. And lastly, we are going to evaluate the effect of the New Deal on the historical role of the federal government and the impact that Roosevelt had on the presidency. So, let's start with women in political roles during this time period, starting with FDR's wife. Not a lot of women got jobs in the New Deal. It's important to understand this. However, there were some women who did benefit from the New Deal, and no one did more than Eleanor Roosevelt. She is the first modern First Lady we've had. Before this, the job was to kind of be in the background, maybe help cook the meals, run the House side of the White House. More ceremonial job. However, Eleanor Roosevelt decided, I'm going to take this job and run with it as far as I can. She became a vocal advocate for causes that she cared about, and she cared about a lot of causes. She did things like she went down into coal mines, she went up into airplanes, not only went up into airplanes, but went up into airplanes with African American members of the Tuskegee Airmen. She visited Native American reservations, she toured the country. She did a lot of this partially because Franklin Roosevelt couldn't do this. He didn't have the power to do this because of the loss of his legs to polio. She also had a newspaper column called My Day and held daily press conferences with female reporters. She was actively trying hard to make sure that women, especially her, had a role in federal politics. So here is Eleanor Roosevelt in an Ohio coal mine. Now, along with all these tours, Mrs. Roosevelt was advocating for public health, public education, promoting the arts. She was calling for more funding in poor rural areas. She was advocating for women to have more political power. She was helping African Americans gain more power. Insofar as women went, she was helping her friend Frances Perkins become the first female cabinet member. And this was necessary because the New Deal was mainly focused on helping men, male workers, male jobs, male people working out with the CCC in the countryside. Women were mostly exempt from the programs, and the most of the New Deal did not cover female workers in any way, shape, or form. So she was filling that hole of who are we not talking about when it comes to the New Deal. So let's look at growth for African Americans politically during this time as well. Again, another group overall neglected by the New Deal. African Americans had been hit hardest by the Depression, worse than even farmers. Black farmers especially had it the worst. They were generally the first to lose their jobs, they were the first to get fired and the last to get hired. Unemployment among African Americans was at nearly 50%, and that's the most optimistic of portrayals. Eleanor Roosevelt was also calling for a racial New Deal as a part of this as well, along with gender reform. She was calling for civil rights to be part of the New Deal. And so, as a part of this reform, FDR, her husband, asked for many African Americans to sort of help him out with creating policy during this time period. Unofficially, he was not hiring people to do this, he was asking people to do this and sort of keeping it under the table. He called this his Black Cabinet. And this included many famous African American men and women during this time. Most famously, it included Mary McLeod Bethune, who was an advocate for African American rights. She was the founder of Bethune-Cookman College. And she was an educator, she was a civil rights activist, she was the real deal. FDR didn't always listen or act based on their suggestions, though. For instance, he did not support an anti-lynching law because he basically thought, if I support an anti-lynching law, that's going to cause every Southern Democrat to run as far away from me as possible. He knew he would lose all Southern Democratic support. Several New Deal programs also tended to exempt farm workers and servant staff from any sort of New Deal programs. This meant that the two jobs that were mainly African American areas of positions were kept out of the New Deal. So here is Mary McLeod Bethune. She was alive from 1875 to 1955, born in South Carolina, but I believe she moved to Florida pretty early in her life. She was an educator, a philanthropist, and a civil rights activist. She literally had to do what your grandfather said he did every morning, which is walk 5 miles to school each day as a child. She was eventually appointed Director of African American Affairs in the National Youth Administration, which was a Rooseveltian program. And during the Second World War, she served as special assistant to the Secretary of War as well. So she was a very prominent African American hire by FDR. And she once said, "The true worth of a race must be measured by the character of its womanhood." Now, let's look at the Indian New Deal, as it was called at the time. So, Native American tribes had lost a lot of their power back in the Dawes Act of the 1880s. That was the one that said Native Americans are no longer a tribe, they are just farmers, basically. They lost any autonomy as well, basically the power to govern themselves. Now they were losing their land to white speculators, and so Roosevelt and his one of his secretary members, a guy named John Collier, tried to stop this and helped to improve conditions on the reservations with what was called the Indian New Deal. This created more schools and hospitals on the reservations. The schools were no longer about kill the Indians, save the man, like the Indian boarding schools had been for a long time. These new schools were also promoting things like language and culture, along with reading, writing, and arithmetic. It gave Native Americans control over their own land with the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, so they became tribes again at that point. So here's John Collier signing the Indian Reorganization Act. Now, let's look at the New Deal coalition during this time, too. Roosevelt's political power, his political skills, and his ability to sort of make alliances during this time created a very large coalition of people, a group of people who were willing to work with Roosevelt during the 1930s and 40s. This included Southern Democratic politicians, Northern factory workers, African Americans, the whole lot of them, and usually these groups are not seen together in the same place at the same time. African Americans are relatively new to the Democratic Party. They had mainly voted Republican since the Civil War. However, FDR convinced a lot of African Americans to vote Democrat instead. And this helped Roosevelt keep control of Congress, keep control of the White House, and helped keep the country somewhat unified, although, as we saw with Roosevelt abandoning the anti-lynching law, he had to make some concessions in order to get people to stay on the same page. Now, let's look at the role of government in this time. The New Deal made the national government much more powerful and active in people's lives, which it had not been for a long time. The federal government had gotten involved with business, something it had avoided for quite a while. It got involved in maintaining the economy, something it had tried to stay out of for decades. And so we see that Roosevelt is diving headfirst into the federal government being massive and powerful and a force for what he considered good. This is probably one of the most controversial ideas to come out of Roosevelt, FDR, the idea that a big government is a force for good, not a force for evil. We also see that the federal government is using government money to care for the poor and the sick and the elderly and the unemployed. This is the first time we see a fully funded and fledged welfare state. This, of course, also still very controversial up through today. Roosevelt did a lot to help the environment. He created national parks, the Tennessee Valley Authority, which is one of the terms you're going to be looking at. And although he had very good intentions, some say that he did too much messing around with the environment. He dammed up rivers, he was using rivers for electricity, and this destroyed natural habitats along the way. Mostly, Roosevelt was the president who sort of set the course for 20th century presidents that came after him. that the president is now the most powerful person in the country, not congressmen, not senators, but the president. Most of the power in the federal government and in departments is now, after Roosevelt, run by the executive. Roosevelt is also the only president to run for re-election more than once. He was elected to 4 terms and died very early on in his fourth. So he actually forced them to create a new amendment to the Constitution saying, okay, you get 2 tries to be president. You get to be elected and re-elected once, but not anymore. And also, we're going to see this federal power grow as we get into World War II, as well as we're going to see next chapter.